Oh, hi there. My name is Reed, and for today, our group will be talking about Incoterms. So for today's agenda, we're going to be talking about what are Incoterms, and also the four Incoterms that our group decided to do the presentation on, which are we have free carrier or FCA, delivered at place unloaded, which are our DPU, Xworks or EXW, and carriage paid to, which is our CPT. So what are Incoterms? So Incoterms very pretty much is a short term for international commercial terms, and it is an internationally recognized rule that defines the obligation of the buyer and the seller when it comes to international trading. And why are there Incoterms? It's pretty much to prevent confusion when it comes to foreign trade contracts, because what it does, like I said, is it clarifies what the seller's obligations are and what the buyer's obligations are. So free carrier Incoterm is an agreement where the seller's obligation is they take responsibility for everything that happens with the cargo from its place of origin. And then once it reaches a carrier, then the buyer takes responsibility from there. So what are the seller's responsibility in a free carrier? We have export packaging, which is cargoes must be packaged for export, because some countries have different requirements when it comes to packaging. Like some requires a specific label, some requires a certain maybe some measurements. And then the sellers must ensure that packaging is in accordance to the export regulation. Loading charges or delivery to port place, because they have to pay for the cargo when it gets put on the truck, and then the truck leaves to go to the carrier or the designated place of drop off. They also have to pay export duty, taxes, or custom clearance because the cargo is leaving their country. What are the buyer's responsibility in a free carrier? We have the origin terminal charges. It's loading on carriage charges. What this means pretty much is once the cargo pretty much reaches its destination country, then the buyer has to pay for everything that happens from then onwards, which is like when it gets loaded onto another, maybe a truck, a rail, or whatever type of transportation system there are. We have insurance, but for insurance, it is negotiable between the buyer and the seller, so they can negotiate who is responsible for that in a free carrier. You got the destination terminal charge, delivery to destination, unloading at destination, and also import duty, taxes, and custom clearance. So this is pretty much the illustration of what a free carrier is. So if you look from over here, so export packaging, loading charges, delivery to port, place, whatever designated drop-off there is, export duties. So in a free carrier, this is something to note, is the seller pays for export duties since it is leaving the country, and the buyer pays for imports since the cargo is arriving in their country. So now I'm gonna pass it on to James to talk about DPU.
Hi everyone, my name is James. For the Incoterm, I chose delivery at place unloaded, DPU. DPU is the only Incoterm rule that includes the seller having to unload the product or good, and that will make the delivery finished, whereas every other thing, it's the other way around. The seller's just delivers it and then it's good to go. So obligations for this Incoterm include the seller and the buyer. The seller's responsible for the invoice and documentation, any other documentation, packaging and marketing, exporting licenses, any customs formality fees. They're also responsible for pre-carriage and main carriage costs, unloading charges, and pre-shipment inspection costs. Once the product has gone into the export stage, the seller must provide the buyer with proof of delivery documentation. And now the buyer's responsible for import, anything import related. So payment disclosed in the sales contract. So whatever they've agreed to pay for the products being shipped to them. They're also responsible for any import formalities or duties on the import, so any taxes, or if there's any problems that import customs are having, the buyer will be responsible to pay any fees associated with that. They're also responsible for import clearance costs, and finally responsible for carriage and delivery to the buyer. So if we look here, it's just a little demonstration, I guess, on how this works. So as you can see, the seller is responsible from the start where it's loaded onto the first truck and then transported to the first carrier. And it's also responsible for any transportation of the product until it gets to a agreed upon location that the buyer and seller have both discussed and agreed upon. After it's reached this place, there's a transfer of risk, and this is where the buyer is now responsible for anything that happens to the products or goods. And that includes anything from it being unloaded from customs, let's say, and delivered to wherever the buyer wants it to get delivered to, whether it be a warehouse or like their main headquarters or anything like that.
Hi guys, my name is Inza and my topic is EX words. So what is EX words? EX words is international trade terms that describes when a seller makes a product available at a design locations and the buyer of the product must cover the transfer cost. EX words is one of the 11 current Incoterms, a set of standardized international trade terms that are published by the International Bureau of Commerce. EX words as a contract option is particularly good for the seller and less good for the buyer. The seller is only required to safely package the goods, label them appropriate, and deliver them to previously agreed upon locations, such as the seller's nearest port. The seller must also have the buyer get export license or other required paperwork, although the buyer must pay the actual fees for the documents. Once the buyer has a goods, it is up to the buyer to cover any expense and account for any risks that pertain to the goods. Risks could include loading the products onto a truck, transporting them to a ship or plane, and dealing with the custom officers, unloading them at their destination, and strong always selling them, even if the seller helps the buyer by loading the product onto the ship, it is still up to the buyer to pay up for if anything goes wrong during the loading. Extra costs are calculated by business at that one to out cost by removing the so-called seller's value add for shipping. For example, suppose company A has placed a pair of printer from company B at $4,000 with an extra shipping cost of $200. To save money, company A finds their third party shippers that would rival them the printer for 170. So to save the 30 on shipping, they make a deal with the company B that is EX words.
My name is Devin, and the Incoterm that I'm going to be talking about is carriage paid to, also known as CPT. So with carriage paid to, the seller delivers the goods at their expense. So the seller is responsible for all freight charges, export fees, and taxes to an agreed upon destination. So if I'm a seller in Canada and I'm exporting to China, I am responsible for all of the export fees to China. Once the seller has delivered the goods to the first carrier, the risk is transferred to the buyer. So once I deliver my goods to, let's say, the first delivery company, which could be a trucking company that's going to take it to a dock, that first carrier, the risk is now transferred to the buyer, because I'm no longer responsible as a seller for what happens to those goods during the transportation process. The seller is also not required to insure the goods, so I'm not required to pay for insurance, so that if anything happens during the transportation process, the goods are insured. This is a visual of the CPT process. So as you can see here, the seller is responsible for carriage up to the destination. So this place of destination, as I said, could be China or wherever you're exporting to. So the seller is responsible for like freight charges and shipping charges up to the destination. And as you can see from this little exclamation mark here, once the goods are delivered to the first carrier, then the risk is transferred to the buyer. So now this carrier is responsible for the goods, and if the goods are damaged, the seller, me, is no longer liable, so I don't have to replace the goods. I'm not required to insure them, so I'm not responsible for the goods being damaged during the shipping process. And then once they reach the place of destination, now the buyer has to arrange how they are going to get those items to them. So once it reaches that country, now they're fully responsible for it, and they have to like load those items from the dock or wherever they landed and ship them to themselves, essentially.